Hello. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the history of life on Earth. So, we've been talking about evolution, and we talked about evidence for evolution, and a big source of our evidence is the fossil record. From the fossil record, we can get an idea of the history of life on Earth and how, when life first evolved and then how living things have changed to give us modern day organisms. And it's a fascinating story. So let's just talk about, a few of the highlights of that. So let's start off with a quiz. First question: how old is the universe? And so what we consider, all the stars and all the planets. Is it 1 to 2 million years, 1 to 2 billion years, 5 to 10 billion years, or 11 to 15 billion years old? Well, the correct answer is 11 to 15 billion years old, about 13.8 billion years. So, looking at how fast galaxies are moving away from our galaxy and working backwards, and looking at you have to talk to an astronomer exactly how to figure this out, but several different lines of evidence all point to this value of about 13.8 billion years old. Okay, so if that's when, the Big Bang occurred about that many years ago, well, then how old is the Earth? You had the Big Bang when matter was created and it's all expanding away from each other. But at some point, things started to cool down and slow down. And so when they started to cool down and slow down, then gravity started taking effect. Things were first moving so fast, nothing would aggregate. But as things lose some of that energy and cool down, then gravity can start pulling things together, and solar systems and planets can start to form. And you get this positive feedback loop. As matter starts to aggregate, you get more gravity, which pulls more matter in, so they aggregate more, and that's how you build planets. So when was our planet built? About 1 to 2 million years ago? About 1 to 2 billion years ago? About 4 to 5 billion years ago? Or about 8 to 10 billion years ago? Well, the answer is 4 to 5 billion years ago, about 4.6 billion years. So, looking at like the age of meteorites, you figure that when meteorites hit the planet, those are pieces of matter that formed about the same time the Earth formed and the rest of our solar system. And so by maybe age, I think you use radiometric dating to age those. And the advantage here is they've been out in outer space the entire time. So there's been no weathering. So those rocks have not changed. They formed when the solar system formed. And so by using radiometric dating, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, you can kind of tell how old it is. I think that's how we figure that out. And again, astronomers and geologists have lots of different ways that they do this, and they all point to that same value. Okay, finally, it's where biologists, let's talk about how long has there been life on Earth? So when did life first evolve? 1 to 2 million years, 1 to 2 billion years, 3 to 4 billion years, or 4 to 5 billion years? The answer is we estimate about 3.8 billion years or so. And so now this one's a little tougher because we have to find the oldest fossils on the planet and then date those rocks. But because, those rocks have not been out in outer space, they've been on the planet where they've been exposed to all those forces that affect rocks on the planet. And so, rocks getting buried, rocks melting, forming new rocks, coming back to the surface. The whole rock cycle has been going on since the Earth was formed, 4.6 billion years ago. And so, first off, you got to find the fossils. And most of the fossils, those rocks have been destroyed. And so, And another problem is that first life was all soft parts. So you don't have skeletons and shells and things that fossilize well. It was bacteria. And so how do you find rocks with old bacterial fossils? Well, you kind of don't. But what you find are what are called trace fossils. You find leftover signs in the rocks that that the most logical explanation, the only way you can explain what's in this rock is it was formed by a living organism. And there are lots of different ways that we can do that. Lots of different things that we look for, like carbon isotope ratios and oxygen isotope ratios. Again, geologists know more about this. But the oldest fossils are called stromatolites. And so these stromatolites, this is formed by something like a biofilm. So, when bacteria grows, and then as bacterial cells die, new cells sort of grow on top, and then other cells sort of grow on top. And so you get this film, and you get this very stereotypical layers of dead bacteria with fresh bacteria growing on top. It's not all that different than the stuff that grows in your bathtub or in your sink. Excuse me. And and then those create very stereotypical fossils like you see here. And so that's kind of what we consider the first signs of life and the oldest signs of life that we can find. And those rocks are about 3.8 billion years old. So the whole idea of how old the Earth is and how long life has been evolving, it pivots around this idea of deep time, which is just a fascinating concept. And it's this idea that these values are sort of unimaginable to us. They're in such a different scale than what we experience. You can imagine 5 or 10 years ago. You can even imagine 100 years ago or a few hundred years ago. When you study history, you can imagine what the world was like. You can even imagine maybe, a few thousand years, what the world was like. But beyond that, it's just unimaginable how long ago this was. So we try to do things to help us wrap our brains around this concept. And I like this idea, and I think this is an interesting idea because this is a kind of one of the hardest things for people to swallow, and makes it, if you have difficulty accepting the idea of evolution, it's because you can't wrap your brain around how long this has been going on. But we've got lots of evidence that suggests that the Earth and life is this old. And so it's been an unimaginable length of time. And so we kind of do some just mental exercises to try to help us understand these big, big numbers in this deep, deep time. So pretend you started counting one number every second. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. You've all done that, right? 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. If you did that, how long would it take until you counted to 1 million? So you can do the math here. You can figure out how many seconds are how many seconds are in a minute. You figure out how many seconds are in an hour, how many seconds are in a day, how many days are in a week, so on. If you did this, just did nothing but count, it would take you about a week and a half with no sleeping, no kind of break. If you just kept counting, that's how long it would take for you to count to 1 million. Okay. Well, how long would it take for you to count to 1 billion doing the same thing? Well, again, for fun, you can pause this, get out your calculator, see if you can figure that out. The answer is almost 32 years. And so I'm guessing that most of you in my class are younger than this. So, the day you're born, you start going 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. It would be until, you were 32. And that's with no breaks, with no stopping, with doing nothing. It would take you that long to count to 1 billion. So that gives you an idea of how large this number is. So then, okay, let's say you wanted to do this to represent how long life has been. Excuse me, I'm sorry, how old the Earth is, 4.6 billion or so. How long would that, you know, take you? I mean, you couldn't do it in a lifetime, right? So if you all you did was count and never did anything else, including sleeping, you could never get anywhere near the value of how many years old Earth is. That's how you can get your mind around it. Now, to be honest, you got to think about this. Some of the, you know, people who are trying to run our country that have these multiple $1 billion that are even way more than this, and you just you can't comprehend how different that is and how large a number that is. And so we want to be able to swallow those big numbers because it's important to synthesize those big numbers to understand how different those numbers are than what we're used to. So, anyway, that's the idea. And so, by looking at the fossil record and aging the rocks and things like that, we can kind of put together the history of the Earth. And that's paleontology. That's what's really fascinating about the Earth. And so there's lots of different ways you can visualize the history of life on Earth. And I've given you some images and some PDFs with these different images in there so you can kind of zoom in on them and look at them. There's lots of different ways you can synthesize this. This is just kind of a neat drawing. This is by Ray Troll. He's a guy who does this really cool art. There's a lot of fish art. And so it gives you an idea of the scale of things. And so the geologists delineate several different time periods. And it's tough to show the details of each time period and keep things proportional. So the time periods are not all the same. Like a year is a year is a year. Like the time period is always the same. But not so with geologic time. We divide things up based upon large, obvious changes in the earth that are obvious in the rock layers. And so you can't draw things necessarily proportional and be able to see the details like you want. So now don't go memorizing all these different values. That's for a geology class. What I want you to do is to pay attention to, like, just know the relative order, like who came first, who came next, and to think about how maybe one organism, how when they evolved, how that affected different kind of organisms later, and how some organisms go extinct, which allows other organisms to become more predominant. That's the kind of stuff I want you to know. Don't measure, don't memorize all these values, and don't necessarily memorize exactly like when this happened or when that happened. Think about the relative thing. Let's just talk about the 10,000 foot view here. Here's another way that we can visualize the history of life on Earth. And you can think of this as sort of like a clock, where at midnight, we've got another image later where it actually does look like a clock. But if you start with this circle, you can see now we can keep things proportional. You can see how different items pop up and in what order they pop up, and sort of the relative amount of time that things existed before other things popped up. Let me pull up my pen here so I can start marking some of these. And so, you can see that, here's when the Earth was formed, at this point. And then here's when we say, sort of the first life, those first bacteria. And you can kind of follow that around on this circle. And if you look at this dark blue line, that's eukaryotes, right? So the first life was prokaryotes, which is the purple line, which we see, wraps all the way around. So that's kind of the first interesting thing. The first life was prokaryotic. And so then it was just nothing but bacteria for billions, for, I don't know, 1.5 billion years, give or take. And then eukaryotic cells evolved, right? But then, they were all still single-celled eukaryotes, like those protozoans that we looked at in lab. And so if you look at this light blue line, that's multicellular life. And so, from here all the way around to here, life was all just single-celled. But then you can see how once multicellularity evolved, how then other things evolved very rapidly. So that, I think, gives you a good idea of, just how long some of these organisms were around. So if you look at here, about 3,200 million years ago, so 3.2 billion years ago, that's when photosynthesis evolves. But if you follow your little diagram here, it's almost a billion years. It's 2.3 billion years ago when you got free oxygen in the atmosphere. And so prior to this time, prior to the 2.3 billion years ago, the atmosphere was very, very different than what it is today. And it was very noxious. Again, most of the organisms, most of these bacteria, the first bacteria that lived for those first billion or so years, oxygen would have been toxic to them. They could not have lived in that environment. It was things like methane and ammonia, and things that are very toxic to you and me. And so when photosynthesis evolved, then that started to release oxygen into the atmosphere. But it took almost a billion years before you got significant measurable levels of oxygen in the atmosphere. Well, what's the significance of that? Thinking about what we've learned in our class, what's the most important use of oxygen? Why do you got to breathe in every few seconds? Remember what we've talked about. Why is oxygen so important? Think back to cellular metabolism. Think about cellular respiration, right? And the electron transport system. Why did we say that worked so well? Because you've got oxygen that really, really wants electrons sitting there, sucking up those high energy electrons that you got from the Krebs cycle. And in the process, that helps to extract energy from the molecules and make a lot of ATP. Remember, of all the steps of metabolism, the electron transport made the most ATP per glucose molecule. But that was only useful if there's oxygen present. Of course, how important oxygen is. And so, you've got all these single-celled prokaryotic organisms for a long time. And then it was only after you got significant levels of oxygen, it still took a long time before eukaryotes could evolve. Because now you can get more efficient metabolism. With the presence of oxygen, you can get more energy, which means you can have bigger cells, more complicated cells, and then eventually you can have organisms that are not just single-celled eukaryotes, but multicellular eukaryotes. Excuse me. So that's the idea of how, when one thing evolved and then that led to another thing, which led to another thing. That's the kind of stuff I would like for you to know. Now, if you look up here to the animals, so here's our class, the green line, and I can't find and so if you look animals, evolved again 550, 560 million years ago or so in the ocean. And we see about 540 million years ago, we had the Cambrian explosion. And we've talked about this before. And this is something that you see in the fossil record where a huge number of different body forms all showed up at about the same time. And all those animal taxa, all those animal phyla that we study in lab, they all popped up around this time. And then there's been no really new ones since then. So it's kind of interesting. It's not like, this one popped up and this one popped up. They all kind of showed up at the same time. So that's pretty interesting. That was about 540 million years ago. And then we look here, about 380 million years ago, the first vertebrate land animals. And so this is, vertebrates evolved in the ocean a long time ago. Excuse me. And when I said the first animals, I was off a little bit. I think I said 550 million years ago. It was farther back than that. 550, 560 million years ago, that was the first vertebrates. That's what I meant to say. And they were still in the ocean, but then about 380 million years ago, they crawled out into the shallow waters and eventually evolved on land. And that would have been your first vertebrate land animals, which would have been the tetrapods, which would have led to us. And what was one of the first one of those? Remember, we talked about Tiktaalik, right? And we said that we thought it was about 380 million years ago, and if we go look at rocks about that old, we are likely to find a transitional fossil, and that's exactly what happened. And so that's your first. That's when vertebrates were transitioning to land. And so then here's another way that we can look, another diagram showing you the evolution of mostly animals. I think this is all animals here. I'm not sure if this is from your book or not. Again, and we can look at different scales. And so what you've probably noticed from the other images we've looked at, and that you've got long billions of years where there's not many different groups, but then you got more and more and more, faster and faster and faster. And so that's another reason why we have to keep things at different scales, is because you've got these long periods where there's not many different organisms in the fossil record. And then more recent periods, these organisms pop up faster and faster and faster and faster. And so that's kind of what you're showing you here. And so you can see that we got on the left, we've got the origin of the solar system. We've got the history of Earth on the left. And you can see these long periods where we don't have much to talk about. But then more recently, here you've got the most recent, again, the evolution of animals and vertebrates. You can see that we can take that small scale here and we can zoom it in, and we can see, different periods and different events within that period, those periods, that time. And then you can take the most recent time periods in this graph, and we can expand that even more, so we can get more and more detail. So we just like to look at different scales. Again, don't memorize this. Just look at the relative comparison between these organisms. And so, again, I've given you a PDF with all this. And this part starts with the Cambrian explosion. And so, like I said, we delineate different geologic time periods based upon obvious changes in the fossil record. And so this is an obvious change in the fossil record where all these different body forms all popped up at once. And so that's the start of the Cambrian period. And that's about 541 million years ago. And so you've seen this on the other ones. I'm showing you this again. You see CA. CA stands for circa, which is a Latin word that means about. So when you see CA, something that's about 541 million years ago. And other interesting things here, if you look at, and I think I said this maybe was animals, but it's not all just animals. It doesn't matter. You see, but during the Pennsylvanian, 300 some million years ago, you see great conifer forests. And so I think that's interesting. That's 300 million years ago. You had these huge forests, these huge plants growing. But remember that it was like 380 million years ago when vertebrates first started to get on land. The plants had been here earlier. And so you didn't have huge herbivores yet. So you had stuff that would eat the plants, but they weren't as efficient. So the plants would grow and then just die and then get buried. And so they get buried and buried and buried and pushed down and pushed down and pushed down. And that becomes that's where fossil fuels came from. And so you've got these things that have been underground for 300 million years. And now we go dig them up. And there's lots of energy in there because it was all living things that had captured sunlight energy, and that energy got buried underground. So now we dig it up and we burn it, and that's where we get fossil fuels from. So those fossil fuels, the important thing to know about that is that carbon has been underground for 300 million years. It's not been part of the global carbon cycle for a huge amount of time. And now we're digging it up and putting it back into the global carbon cycle at a very rapid rate. And that's the source of climate change. Okay, so if we zoom in even more, we can look at the mammals, our group, and they first evolved in the Triassic, so much earlier than what you see in this diagram, but they were not dominant. They were small and diversified, but they mostly lived underground. Think of things like shrews and mice and small mammals that you're familiar with. They were not dominant animals. The reptiles were dominant. The dinosaurs were dominant. But at the start of this period, here you see this is 66 million years ago, and that's when a big asteroid hit the Earth and radically changed the Earth's climate, which led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so now this big group that was the dominant group on the planet goes extinct. That allowed the mammals to diversify, and now mammals are, one of the dominant forms of life on the planet. And in a very short time after those mammals, as the dinosaurs went extinct, the mammals began to expand. Now, this was all on land, right? The mammals evolved on land, but around 50 some million years ago, they moved back into the ocean. And so that's why we have aquatic mammals, cetaceans, dolphins and whales and things today. So anyway, I think that's interesting. And then, of course, as you get more recent, some 5 million years ago, you start to see hominids. You start to see people, species that were in our family tree. You start to see lots of clear human ancestors, but many, many species in our family tree that existed for millions of years, but then went extinct. And now we're the only ones left. But there were lots of others in our genus and then other closely related genera that are in the fossil record. So again, this kind of gives you an idea of where our species comes from relative to all this other evolution over time. So we talked about plate tectonics a little bit. And we'll just kind of reiterate that, how the continents are moving around and how that helps to explain the biogeography, the distribution of organisms we see today, and the distribution of fossils and where we find them. And you'll recall that, the most recent supercontinent, when all the continents were all glommed together, that's Pangea. And that, if you look here, 225 million years ago or so. And so this is when tetrapods are evolving. This is when vertebrates are starting to crawl out of the ocean and evolve along that shoreline and eventually become tetrapods. And so that's when all the continents were glommed together. And so that's when, Tiktaalik lived. And if you look on my graph here, I'm showing you on this Pangea where that fossil Tiktaalik was found. Now, when it was found, just a few years ago, it was up above the Arctic Circle. It was very far north and it's very cold and very desolate. But look at where that piece of land was 225 million years ago. That piece of land was at pretty much our latitude, about where Kentucky is. And so the climate would have been much warmer. And so if you think about where it is now, you think, wow, how could anything have evolved or lived up there above the Arctic Circle? Well, it didn't. That piece of land was much further south. And so that's kind of I think these are just fascinating things about our planet's history. Here's a cool diagram. You may have seen this on the internet. It's where they took Pangea and they've mapped all of the modern day countries on where they occurred. So if Pangea existed today, this is where everything would be. And so this is kind of fun to study, to get an idea of where, you're familiar with our modern countries. Well, where would they have been 225 million years ago? And of course, you can see, how Africa, North America, South America, they were all just right next to each other. They all fit together like a very, puzzle. If you've ever looked at a globe and thought, wow, these things look like They all should fit together like a puzzle. Well, they did. And we saw this graph earlier. If we look at distributions of different fossils of many different organisms, you can see that based upon, where the continents are today, you're like, gosh, this doesn't make much sense. But when you realize that all those continents were all stuck together, it makes a lot more sense. And so here we are in the Triassic, about 200 million years ago. So Pangea is breaking up, and this is when dinosaurs are becoming to dominate the Earth. And this is when our first mammals evolved on land. But again, they were small. They were like rodents, mice, rats, maybe squirrels. Lived underground, but they were definitely, there were so many large reptile predators that the mammals were not able to dominate and diversify. And so that's happened for 140 million years. Mammals were not, I guess, I would say not as prevalent, not as dominant as the dinosaurs and other reptiles. We talked about marsupial mammal evolution. And so the marsupials evolved and then spread from South America across Antarctica to Australia because, again, these were all connected back then. And so here about 70 million years ago, the marsupials evolved, and you can see what the, sea levels were greater. And so that's why you don't see as much of the sea levels were higher, which is why you don't see as much of the land in this map. And you see how these marsupials, they evolved and they spread to Asia, Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia. But then marsupials in these other places went extinct, right? We don't have marsupials here in North America. We have one. We've got the possum, right? Europe and Asia, they don't have marsupials. Antarctica, of course, doesn't have marsupials. They all went extinct. But where do you find a lot of marsupials? South America and Australia. Australia, South America. And that's because they were spread all across there, but then the intermediate steps went extinct. But we can find fossils of them in places like Antarctica. And that's how we can explain that distribution that we see today. So here we are about 65 million years ago. And so imagine, we get that marsupials spreading, and we've got placental mammals spreading, but they're still very small. And then a meteor hits the Earth. And that meteor didn't hit too far from us. If you've ever been to Cancun, right around Cancun is where that meteor hit. So if you look in the ocean, just off the coast of Mexico, where Cancun is, you can see this giant crater. And that's where that meteor hit, and that radically changed the Earth's climate. And of course, that caused the dinosaurs to go extinct. And the mammals, which were small and somewhat diverse, then were able to explode and come to become very important vertebrates all over the world today. Okay, one of the last sort of interesting things to talk about as far as talking about the history of life on Earth are mass extinctions. And from the fossil record, we can see 5 mass extinctions where large numbers of organisms died off. And we are very likely in the middle of the 6th mass extinction right now. If you look at the rate at which we're losing species today, it is as high or higher than what we can estimate from the fossil record. And whereas lots, things called these, we have good explanations for the earlier 5 mass extinctions. Pretty clearly humans are causing this 6th one right now. Oh, that was kind of a bad drawing, but you get the idea. We're destroying habitat. We're directly killing off species. We're changing the climate. And so that's why we're losing lots of species. We're the cause of the 6th one right now. And it is comparable to what we've seen in the past. But there have been 5 that we see in the fossil record. And so you see I've got these kind of already marked. But this graph from your book looks at the different extinctions. Now we're looking at the number of families of marine animals. And so think about that for a second. Why are marine animals a good group to look at these trends in the fossil record? Why look at marine animals specifically? Well, what are we talking about? We're talking about things like mollusks, fish, organisms that we've talked about in lab before. And they live in the ocean. So when they die, they are likely to sink to the bottom and get covered in sediment. And things like mollusks have hard shells, and things like vertebrates have hard skeletons. They have hard parts. And so they're more likely to be covered in sediment, and then they've got hard parts, which are more likely to fossilize. So there's a very good record in the fossils of these marine animals. And so they're a good group to study these long-term trends. When you study these long-term trends, you see you've got, here they're showing you again the Cambrian explosion when you got all these different animal phyla that showed up. And then since then, we've seen some mass extinctions. And we are probably in a similar mass extinction right now. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier. This is another final way that we can sort of wrap our brain around this concept of deep time. We can scale the history of the Earth to a day and scale it to 24 hours. And so if we do that, it's very similar to that circular diagram that we saw earlier. Things are going to pop up at the same point on the circle, but by scaling it to a day, again, it's just trying to help you wrap your brain around these incredible lengths of time. So in this example, this would be that the Earth formed at midnight last night. Whatever day you're looking at this, just think back to midnight of last night. And then on this clock, you can see, okay, at 8 in the morning, the last universal common ancestor, we want to find something like here, oxygen, around just before 11, not quite before lunchtime is when you had free oxygen, things like that. Well, by putting it on that scale and looking at our species, that means that our species shows up 4 seconds before midnight tonight. That's how little time our species has been on the planet relative to the existence of the planet and relative to the existence of these other organisms. And that's really interesting. And so I'll just leave you with this. I got from a book. One of the best metaphors for this idea about this idea. Consider the Earth's history as the old measure of the English yard, which was the distance from the king's nose to the tip of his outstretched hand. If you think about that distance, one stroke of a nail file on his middle finger erases our human history if we scale Earth's history to that length. And so that's really interesting. And so when you think about that, that's just pretty cool that our species has been around for a very short amount of time. And maybe that'll help you kind of wrap your brain around this idea of deep time and how long things have been going on. Anyway, I think this is fascinating. Of course, you take a class in paleontology, you'll study about this a lot more, or geology or anything. But again, I think one of the biggest constraints to understanding and accepting evolution is, our brains aren't equipped to comprehend such large numbers. But hopefully we tried to help you with some of those large numbers a little bit. That's what I've got. So please let me know if you got any questions. I will see you later.